Alright, so let's talk about it. Because what is happening around Rick Ross right now is not just another messy rap headline, not just another social media joke, not just another week of people trolling a celebrity for clout. No. What we are watching looks a whole lot bigger than that. This looks like the public cracking open one of the most carefully maintained images in hip-hop and asking a brutal question out loud. Was the Rick Ross empire always a lot shakier than it looked? And I'm telling you right now, that question is getting louder by the day. Because in what feels like one non-stop avalanche of bad optics, bad timing, resurfaced receipts, old enemies, new embarrassments, and internet jokes that will not die, Rick Ross has found himself standing in the exact place somebody like Rick Ross can never afford to stand. He looks vulnerable. Not mysterious. Not unbothered. Not above it all. Vulnerable. And that is the one thing Rick Ross spent almost 2 decades convincing the world he could never be. Think about how wild this has gotten. In a very short stretch of time, Ross has been filmed in a commercial airport terminal while the internet roasted him for not being on a private jet. His jewelry got dragged into public debate after one awkward comment opened the door to speculation about fake stones. 50 Cent's old Ross's broke narrative got revived all over again. Drake fans keep reposting the same clips and the same jokes like the feud never ended. People are still bringing up the backstage punch from the Not Like Us situation. Officer Ricky is getting mentioned in every second discussion. Freeway Ricky Ross still comes up under every post. And right in the middle of all of that, Ross sits on camera, gets asked whether the internet's estimate of his net worth at $150 million is accurate, and answers with the exact words. Yeah, that's set in stone. That one sentence may end up being one of the most expensive things Rick Ross has said in years. Because once you say a number like that publicly, and once you stamp it with certainty, you invite the audience to compare the number to the reality. You invite people to start matching the flex to the footage. The lifestyle to the optics. The boss talk to the receipts. The mythology to the moment. And the problem for Ross is that the moment he picked to lock in that number might be the exact moment his public image was least prepared to survive that level of scrutiny. This is not really about whether Rick Ross has money. This is about whether the version of Rick Ross that people have been sold for years is still believable. This is about what happens when a rap persona built on excess, authority, and untouchable status gets dragged into a public environment where every flex can be clipped, replayed, fact-checked, memed, and torn apart in real time. This is about whether the biggest boss image still works once the audience starts noticing cracks. And by the time we get to the end of this, you're going to understand why so many people online are not saying Rick Ross is in a rough patch. They're saying something much worse. They're saying the aura is gone. And once aura leaves a rapper whose whole brand was aura, you're not just fixing a rollout. You are fighting for your entire legacy. So let's slow this all the way down and walk through it properly, because this collapse did not come from one random bad day. This is what happens when old narratives, current embarrassments, and personal choices all hit the public at once. It becomes impossible to separate the joke from the truth, the rumor from the brand damage, and the past from the present. And Ross, whether he realizes it or not, has spent years giving his critics a giant pile of material to reach back into. Let's start with the moment that quietly detonated everything. Because the internet loves spectacle, but it loves contradiction even more. Rick Ross was on a promo run, doing what Rick Ross always does when he has a project to sell. Big energy. Big personality. Big jewelry. Big language. Luxury rap. Success talk. Boss rhetoric. He was rolling out his 12th studio album, Set in Stone, and the theme was exactly what you would expect from Ross. Wealth, polish, abundance, the finest version of the Ross fantasy. He sold the album like an experience. Like pressing play was not listening to songs, it was entering a lifestyle. That's Ross. He has always understood that his music was never just about bars. It was about atmosphere. He built an empire off atmosphere. And in the middle of that rollout, the interviewer pulls out a phone, runs a search, and asks him one simple question. It says your net worth is $150 million. Is that accurate? Now a lot of artists, a lot of celebrities, a lot of public figures, when they get hit with a money question like that, they dodge. They laugh it off. They say they don't discuss personal finances. They say the internet makes things up. They say it's in the ballpark. They say who knows. They leave themselves room. Ross didn't do that. He smiled, leaned into the branding of the album, and basically stamped the number as fact. Yeah, that's set in stone. And that was it. That was the opening. Because the second you say that, you are no longer just playing with image. You are giving the public a benchmark. You are giving your enemies a target. You are giving meme pages, reaction channels, rival fanbases, critics, bloggers, and every bored person with a phone permission to start measuring everything they see against that number. And within hours, that is exactly what they did. The posts started piling up. The airport clip. The tour promotions. The jewelry debate. The old lawsuits. The old taunts from 50. The old Officer Ricky material. The Drake feud. The backstage punch. All of it started getting thrown into one giant online argument about whether Rick Ross is actually who Rick Ross says he is. And that is where the story stops being a normal rollout problem and starts looking like a credibility crisis. Because here is the thing about a rapper whose entire identity is based on power. You can survive being mocked for being weird. You can survive being mocked for being corny. You can survive even being mocked for dropping a weak record. But when your core brand is dominance, and people start questioning whether you even live the life you're describing, every single joke hits harder. Now let's go to the jewelry conversation, because this is where the week really started to slip in a way Ross probably did not fully appreciate in the moment. During the same general wave of promo chatter, somebody tells Ross they have never seen anyone wear ice quite like he does. Under normal circumstances, that is a softball. That is a setup for Ross to grin, talk about quality, talk about taste, talk about luxury, talk about emerald cuts and rare pieces, and all the usual Ross language. Easy. Instead, Ross makes a joke about talking to jewelers in Miami who sell counterfeit diamonds. He says it like a punchline. The room moves. The conversation keeps flowing. But the internet doesn't move on. Because online, context dies fast and suspicion lives forever. And once that clip started spreading, people immediately locked on to the one thing that someone with Ross's image cannot casually joke about without consequences: fake jewelry. Now, to be fair, Ross appeared to treat it as clowning. He later made it clear that the watch in question was supposed to be legitimate, and he framed the whole fake stone remark as him joking around. But by then, the important part had already happened. The doubt was already born. And that is the thing about doubt. It doesn't need to win the argument to do damage. It only needs to exist. Once people start saying, wait, what if some of that jewelry isn't what it looks like, it changes the way they watch every future clip. It changes the way they interpret every future flex. It changes the emotional relationship between the audience and the image. The image stops feeling unquestionable. Now it feels testable. That's a dangerous shift. And right when that shift was underway, the airport footage lands. This is the kind of thing that, for a normal person, would mean absolutely nothing. Flying commercial is not a scandal. Standing in a terminal is not a scandal. Waiting for a boarding call is not a scandal. Millions of people do it every day. But Rick Ross is not a normal public figure selling a normal image. Rick Ross has spent years presenting himself as the man above ordinary limitations. Bigger car, bigger chain, bigger house, bigger bottle, bigger room, bigger life. The whole aesthetic depends on the idea that Ross does not move like everybody else. So when footage circulates showing him in a commercial airport terminal, and the clip is framed in a way that makes it look like he is trying not to be seen, the internet doesn't receive that footage neutrally. It turns it into symbolism. Suddenly it isn't just Rick Ross at the airport. It becomes, if he's really worth what he says he's worth, why is he here? If he's really living that boss life, why does this look regular? If the jet life is real, why are we watching boarding gate content? And once that narrative starts, every explanation feels defensive. Ross, being Ross, did not stay silent. He turned it into content. He joked that his private jet was in the shop getting upgraded. He framed the commercial flight like a strategic move. He tried to laugh at the situation before it could laugh at him. That is smart in theory. But here is the problem. Jokes only work as damage control when the audience still believes the underlying reality. If the public already thinks something might be off, joking can read less like confidence and more like improvisation. And that is what started happening to Ross. Instead of the explanation putting the story to bed, it fed the meme cycle. People started treating the jet story like another part of the performance. Another line. Another spin. Another example of Ross always having a response but never fully killing the suspicion. That is what a credibility crack looks like. Not one catastrophic revelation. Just a series of moments where the official explanation no longer lands with the same authority it used to. And once that authority weakens, old enemies smell blood. Which brings us to Drake. Because one of the most fascinating parts of the Ross situation is how much of his current image damage is self-inflicted through sheer inability to let certain feuds breathe. If you've been following rap for long enough, you know the Rick Ross and Drake relationship used to feel untouchable. Their records had chemistry. They sounded expensive together. Ross, at one point, publicly praised Drake as one of his favorite artists to work with. Their collaborations helped define a certain era of luxury rap crossover records. There was history there. There was commercial success there. There was mutual benefit there. And then everything changed. Once Drake fell out with Future and Metro Boomin, lines got drawn fast. Ross chose his side. Publicly. Decisively. And when Drake responded by putting Ross in the blast radius of the feud, the relationship went from industry tension to full public rupture. Ross hit back. Drake hit back. Fans picked sides. The internet archived everything. And after Kendrick Lamar escalated the larger anti-Drake moment into a full cultural event, many people felt Ross had landed on the winning side of history simply by standing with the anti-Drake camp. That should have been enough. If you are Ross, and the tide turns against Drake, and you already got your shots off, and your side appears to have the crowd momentum, the strategic move is obvious. Take the win. Get quiet. Go sell the album. Look above it. But Ross didn't do that. He kept talking. And talking. And posting. And referencing. And joking. And dragging the tension forward long after a lot of people expected him to move on. That is where public perception starts to mutate. Because feuds are not judged only by who had the better diss or who got more cheers. They are judged by posture. By who looks consumed. By who looks like they need the beef more. By who seems unable to stop orbiting the other person. And Ross started looking orbit-bound. He was still taking shots at Drake's plane. Still joking about Drake's image. Still turning Drake into rollout fuel. Still pulling Drake into conversations that did not need Drake in them. At a certain point, the audience stops thinking, Ross is standing on business. And starts thinking, why is Ross still here? That is not a small difference. That is the difference between appearing victorious and appearing fixated. And when your critics are already questioning your authenticity in other areas, fixation becomes one more leak in the ship. Then came the moments where Ross was openly reacting to Drake-related content in a way that felt less like a boss above the chaos and more like somebody deeply invested in keeping the conflict alive. Reading comments. Mocking releases. Revisiting the subject in interviews. Forcing the feud back into the center of attention even when co-hosts or audiences seemed ready to move on. That does not strengthen the image. It narrows it. The boss becomes the guy still talking about another man's rollout while trying to sell his own. And that is where the Drake story stops helping Ross and starts quietly hurting him. Because no matter how funny some of Ross's lines were, no matter how entertaining his personality is, there is something deeply unflattering about an artist on album number 12 spending that much energy maintaining beef visibility. Especially when the beef is happening on top of every other issue already in the air. Now add 50 Cent back into the picture, and the problem gets even worse. Because 50 is not just another rival. 50 is one of the most relentless image saboteurs rap has ever produced. He understands repetition. He understands humiliation. He understands how to take one weak point and turn it into a permanent nickname, a permanent joke, a permanent stain. Once 50 finds a vulnerability, he doesn't just attack it once. He builds infrastructure around it. And Ross gave him infrastructure years ago. When Ross gets asked whether things between him and 50 have improved, and he basically says no, never, that tells you the hostility is still alive. Then Ross goes into the familiar attack package. Critiques of 50's style, his business arrangements, his living situation, his ownership, his history. Ross tries to minimize 50's power while maximizing his own. Again, on paper, that sounds like Ross being Ross. But there is a huge problem. 50 has spent years floating the idea that when legal pressure forced Ross's financials into the open, the real story wasn't wealth. The real story was weakness. Whether that claim was ever fully proven in the public imagination is almost secondary at this point, because the meme power of it is massive. Once the public already has Officer Ricky in one hand and Ross is broke in the other, any bad optic in the present gets attached to old narrative tools that are already waiting on the shelf. That is why the airport clip hit harder than it otherwise would have. That is why the jewelry questions hit harder. That is why the tour promo talk hit harder. That is why the $150 million line hit harder. Because those moments did not enter a clean environment. They entered an environment already crowded with years of mockery, suspicion, and unresolved brand contradictions. And if we're being honest, the deepest of those contradictions is still the one Ross has never fully escaped. Officer Ricky. This is the ghost that never left the room. Long before the airport jokes, long before the Drake tension, long before the 50 rumors came back around, Ross had one original sin in the eyes of a certain part of the rap audience, the gap between the identity he sold and the employment records that later surfaced. That story has been retold so many times that it almost exists as folklore now. Before becoming Rick Ross the rap mogul, William Roberts worked as a corrections officer. Then a photo surfaced. Then there was denial. Then there were records. Then the denial itself became part of the humiliation. Then rivals never let go of it. That sequence matters. Because had Ross owned it immediately, framed it as a pre-fame chapter, laughed at it, and moved forward, maybe the story would have faded faster. Maybe not entirely, but faster. Instead, the early response became part of the mythology. And that is what people remember. Not just the job. The denial. In rap, the cover-up often stains harder than the underlying fact. That is why Officer Ricky lasted so long. Not because the audience believes no rapper can ever have had a square job before fame. That's not it. Plenty of artists had regular jobs. Plenty of artists had backgrounds that didn't perfectly match the image they later sold. The reason this one stuck is because Ross built such a specific character. Such a deliberate, larger-than-life street boss image. Such a theatrical mythology of authority and scale. The contrast was too clean. Too dramatic. Too easy for enemies to weaponize. And once a contradiction that strong exists, it becomes universal ammo. Anytime Ross stumbles, it comes back. Anytime Ross gets into a feud, it comes back. Anytime Ross says something too grand, it comes back. That kind of narrative scar never fully heals. Now layer onto that the long-running discomfort around the name itself. Because Rick Ross was not just a cool name the artist stumbled onto in a vacuum. The association with the real Freeway Ricky Ross has always lived in the background of the brand. The legal fight over that name only cemented the conversation. Even though the rapper prevailed in court, the moral discomfort some people felt about using a real figure's story or identity aura as part of a rap persona never vanished. And again, this is crucial. Ross survived that. He built through that. He succeeded despite that. That is what makes the current moment so interesting. This is not a story about a man who never had success. Quite the opposite. Rick Ross absolutely built something real. He had hits. He had albums. He had label influence. He had features that shaped an era. He had business expansion. He had voice, presence, branding, and the kind of instantly recognizable sonic identity most artists would kill for. That part matters, because without it, this whole conversation would not be compelling. The reason people are obsessed with whether Rick Ross is finished is precisely because Rick Ross was once so effective at making the persona feel bulletproof. He was not some fringe figure bluffing his way through 2 mixtapes. He was an actual major rapper with actual impact. Which is why the mismatch between the real achievements and the current public mockery feels so jarring. Because yes, Ross did build. He built in music. He built in branding. He built in business. He built in real estate imagery. He built in franchising. He built in that larger mythology of abundance that became inseparable from his sound. And one of the biggest symbols of that build is the estate. The mansion. The acreage. The lawns. The videos. The self-shot content of Ross riding around his property like a king inspecting his land. For years, those visuals worked brilliantly. They weren't just flexes. They were mythology maintenance. They were proof of concept visuals for the Ross fantasy. The audience sees the scale and says, alright, maybe this guy really is living like that. But here's the problem with symbolism. Once other parts of the image start getting questioned, the symbolism can flip. What once looked aspirational can start looking compensatory. What once looked like evidence can start looking like overcompensation. The mansion does not automatically save the jet narrative. The lawn videos do not automatically save the jewelry narrative. The boss talk does not automatically save the authenticity narrative. And suddenly the audience starts comparing symbols against symbols instead of just accepting the whole package. That is a dangerous place for any image-driven artist to land. Then came one of the most damaging public feeling moments of the entire saga, the not like us situation in Drake's orbit, because regardless of how you feel about the strategy, once Ross allowed himself to be publicly connected to that backstage confrontation and the aftermath chatter, it changed his aura. It made him look exposed. It made him look reachable. It made him look like the person entering another man's territory and not controlling the energy that followed. That's devastating for someone whose whole image is control. And rap audiences are incredibly sensitive to posture. They might forgive losing a song. They might forgive saying too much online. They might forgive an ugly rollout. But when a person whose image is command appears physically or socially out of command in a public setting, the psychological shift can be severe. It tells the audience, maybe the room doesn't move for him like it used to. Maybe the fear factor is gone. Maybe the respect factor has become negotiable. That doesn't mean all of those things are objectively true. It means the perception space opened. And perception is everything here. Because let's be very clear, a huge part of what is happening to Ross is not a courtroom issue, not a balance sheet issue, not even a music issue. It is a public believability issue. It is a story issue. Ross sold the story of Rick Ross better than almost anybody. Now the public is testing the story with greater aggression than he can comfortably manage. That is the heart of this. And by the time we get deeper into this era, with Set in Stone entering the picture and the rollout leaning hard into luxury again, the irony becomes impossible to ignore. Here is Ross asking the audience to immerse themselves in his elevated world while the internet is busy running a completely different documentary in parallel. In Ross's version, he is still the boss, still the architect, still the heavyweight, still the man whose life is the lifestyle. In the internet's version, he is a character struggling to keep the illusion coherent. That is a brutal split screen. And the more Ross talks, the more chances people get to compare the two versions. Now, I want to be fair here, because fairness actually matters if you want to understand why this conversation has traction. There is a lazy version of this topic where people act like Rick Ross is some total fraud with no accomplishments, no assets, no wins, no substance, and that version is nonsense. Ross has real career history. Real commercial relevance. Real records that matter. Real business activity. Real visibility. He is not some random internet-created paper mogul who got exposed after 2 Instagram stories. That would be too simple. The real story is much more uncomfortable. The real story is that Ross may have built enough reality to support the persona for a long time, but the persona itself may have become so oversized, so polished, and so dependent on uninterrupted dominance that even normal stumbles now look catastrophic. In other words, success did not protect him from image collapse. Success may actually have made the collapse more dramatic. Because the higher you sell the illusion, the harsher the fall when people sense even minor slippage. And Ross has been dealing with slippage from multiple directions at once. From the past, Officer Ricky, the name controversy, questions of constructed identity. From rivals, 50s long-running narrative warfare, Drake's continued jabs, fanbase mockery. From optics, airport footage, jewelry chatter, tour chatter, punchline moments. From himself, repeated engagement, over-explaining, continuing to feed feuds that perhaps should have been starved. And here's where I think things get really dangerous for Ross psychologically, if not financially. When a public figure starts taking hits from multiple directions at once, the temptation is to answer everything. To reassert the brand louder. To post more. To show more property. To remind people of the businesses. To explain the travel. To joke harder. To clap back faster. But in a moment like this, volume can become evidence of insecurity. That is a trap a lot of major artists fall into. They think more content equals more control. Sometimes more content just gives the audience more angles. That may be what Ross is walking into right now. Because if you really are secure at the level you say you are, the public expects a certain kind of silence from you. A certain kind of removal. A certain kind of "I don't even need to answer this" energy. When instead you seem to be everywhere, always responding, always repositioning, always dragging old opponents back into the room, people start reading that activity not as power but as need. And once the boss looks needy, the mythology suffers. This is why that $150 million line was such a gift to critics. Not because it proves he does or does not have that kind of money, but because it locked Ross into a version of himself at the exact moment when the audience was most eager to challenge it. Had he laughed it off, people still would have joked. Had he declined to answer, people still would have speculated. But by saying the number was solid, by saying it was set in stone, he transformed the argument from vague internet chatter into a perception test with a scoreboard. Now every future clip gets evaluated against that number. Every future compromise gets measured against that number. Every future boss line gets framed by that number. That is an own goal in the middle of an image storm. And there's something else here that matters. Ross's best version has always been the version who makes opulence feel cinematic rather than defensive. The version whose delivery is so rich, so textured, so self-assured that you don't even think to interrogate it. You just let the atmosphere wash over you. That Ross is compelling. That Ross is persuasive. That Ross can take simple content and make it feel expensive. But when Ross enters explanation mode, something changes. The magic comes down a little. The curtain opens a little. The machinery becomes visible. And once the machinery becomes visible, fans start asking how much of the spectacle was always just performance architecture. Again, every rapper performs to some extent. Every public figure curates. That is not unique to Ross. What is unique to Ross is how heavily his artistic identity relies on the audience accepting the performance as natural extension rather than theater. The minute it feels like theater, the whole project becomes easier to mock. That is why this is bigger than whether a watch was real. Bigger than whether a flight was commercial. Bigger than whether a feud lasted too long. Those are symptoms. The disease is disbelief. And disbelief spreads fast online, because every old clip becomes retroactive proof of whatever people already want to believe. If they want to believe Ross is still a heavyweight mogul, the estate videos and business talk support that. If they want to believe Ross is overcompensating, those same videos now support that too. That is how brand collapse begins. Not when the truth becomes universally obvious. When the image stops controlling the interpretation. Ross used to control the interpretation. Now he doesn't. The internet does. And the internet is cruelest when it senses that a person cannot stop feeding it. Now let's talk about legacy, because that is where this story actually matters. Not just as gossip, not just as entertainment, but as a case study in how major rap figures can damage their own historical standing without necessarily losing their actual achievements. Rick Ross's legacy should, in theory, be secure in a lot of ways. He has catalog. He has records people remember. He has a voice nobody mistakes for anyone else. He has a real role in the sound and spectacle of his era. He helped shape careers around him. He understood branding at a high level. He made luxury feel southern in a way that changed the texture of mainstream rap. Those things do not disappear because of a bad month online. But legacy is not just about output. Legacy is about the final emotional image people carry when they say your name. And that emotional image can absolutely be weakened by years of avoidable choices. Ross did not have to keep every feud alive. Ross did not have to respond to every jab. Ross did not have to make every rollout partly about somebody else. Ross did not have to leave himself exposed on old identity issues by handling them imperfectly. Ross did not have to lean into certainty around public net worth talk when a little ambiguity would have protected him. These are choices. And the public is now judging the choices just as hard as the accomplishments. That is why some people are asking whether Ross has damaged his own legacy. Not erased it. Damaged it. There is a difference. You cannot erase what he did. You can absolutely diminish how people feel about it. And the saddest part, if you are a Ross supporter, is that there was probably another path available. There is a version of Rick Ross who saw the Drake war as a one-round obligation, got his shots off, and then disappeared back into the music. There is a version of Ross who, years earlier, neutralized Officer Ricky by owning it cleanly and early. There is a version of Ross who never lets the audience see him scrambling to explain normal optics through extraordinary storytelling. There is a version of Ross who treats the internet like background noise instead of a stage he has to dominate every day. There is a version of Ross who lets the mansion, the catalog, the label history, and the business footprint speak for themselves. That version might look calmer today. Stronger today. More inevitable today. Instead, the version of Ross the internet is dealing with right now feels louder and more fragile at the same time. That is not a great combination. Because fragility with volume reads like panic. And panic is not boss energy. Now, to be even more direct, I think the reason this conversation has exploded is because Rick Ross built a persona based on a promise that is extremely difficult to maintain once audiences get older and more cynical. That promise was simple: I am the embodiment of scale. I am bigger than the average rapper. I am richer, heavier, smoother, less rattled, more established, more luxurious, more powerful. I am the fantasy, but I am also the fact. That worked beautifully for a long time. But the older a persona gets, the more expensive it becomes to maintain. Eventually the audience begins to wonder whether the fantasy is still advancing or whether it is just being replayed. Eventually they notice when the same flex has to do more work than it used to. Eventually they ask whether the authority comes from reality or from repetition. Ross may have entered that phase. And if he has, the answer is not more explanation. The answer would be reinvention. Or radical silence. Or undeniable music. Or some combination of all three. Because the one thing he cannot do is continue feeding the exact cycle that is reducing his aura. Every Drake mention that feels unnecessary shrinks him. Every 50 response that feels recycled shrinks him. Every overconfident line that inspires an easy meme shrinks him. Every attempt to outstory a credibility problem shrinks him. The internet is telling him, very loudly, that it no longer wants the same script from him without stronger proof. And maybe that is what Set in Stone is really up against. Not just sales. Not just reviews. Not just playlist performance. Believability. If the music comes in undeniable, maybe some of this quiets down. If the music misses, or even just arrives as more atmospheric Ross without a fresh edge, the criticism is going to feel louder than ever. Because once a rollout becomes a referendum on the artist's image, the album stops being just an album. It becomes evidence. It becomes testimony. It becomes either a rebuttal or an exhibit for the prosecution. That's the level Ross is playing on now. And if we zoom all the way out, there's actually a broader lesson here that goes beyond Ross. It's about public identity. It's about how dangerous it is when a person spends years building a myth larger than any ordinary human life can sustain. Because eventually life gives the audience contradictory footage. Eventually the internet finds the awkward angle. Eventually a rival says the right thing at the right time. Eventually an old chapter resurfaces. Eventually the mythology has to coexist with the archive. And the archive is undefeated. Ross is not the first artist to learn that. He will not be the last. But he might be one of the clearest examples of what happens when an artist keeps trying to outtalk the archive instead of outgrowing it. That is why this moment feels different. This does not feel like a simple, they're hating on Ross cycle. This feels like the public deciding it is done taking the Ross image at face value. That does not mean the public is right about every rumor. That does not mean every joke is fair. That does not mean Ross has no money or no relevance or no accomplishments. It means the burden of proof has shifted. And once the burden of proof shifts onto the artist is already losing a certain kind of battle. Because legends are not supposed to have to explain the costume while wearing it. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a Rick Ross who still has real history, real status, and real name value, but who is also facing one of the ugliest perception storms of his career. It leaves us with an album rollout happening under a cloud of skepticism. It leaves us with old enemies looking newly credible to people who once dismissed them. It leaves us with a public that now treats Ross less like a myth and more like an argument. And most importantly, it leaves us with a question that Ross himself accidentally made unavoidable the second he said that number out loud. If $150 million is really set in stone, then why does so much of this look shaky? That is the question. Not because flying commercial is shameful. Not because one joke about jewelry proves anything. Not because rival fanbases are objective judges. but because image-based artists live and die by the alignment between what they say and what the audience thinks it sees. And right now, for a lot of people, that alignment is broken. That is the danger. Because once the audience starts pulling at a loose thread, they don't stop at the thread. They pull until they find out whether the whole sweater comes apart. That is what is happening to Rick Ross in real time. The audience is pulling. On the money talk. On the boss talk. On the Drake talk. On the 50 talk. On the Officer Ricky story. On the jewelry talk. On the travel optics. On the whole construction of who Rick Ross is supposed to be. And Ross, instead of stepping back and giving the fabric less tension, keeps tugging from the other side. That almost never ends well. Now maybe Ross proves everybody wrong. Maybe the album lands hard. Maybe the business still runs strong. Maybe the public gets bored and moves on. Maybe all of this really is just a noisy week blown into a huge narrative because the internet feeds on humiliation. That's possible. But even if that happens, the bigger damage may already be done. Because once a certain kind of doubt enters the room, it doesn't fully leave. The invincibility is gone. The unquestioned aura is gone. The automatic benefit of the doubt is gone. And when those things leave, the artist does not necessarily disappear. But the way people talk about that artist changes forever. That is what legacy damage looks like. Not instant destruction. Permanent reduction. So at this point, the real issue may not be whether Rick Ross is actually finished. The real issue may be whether the version of Rick Ross that people believed in for years is finished. Because those are not the same thing. The man can keep making money. The man can keep owning property. The man can keep dropping music. The man can keep traveling and branding and posting and doing deals. And still lose the one thing that made the whole package feel larger than life. Belief. And if belief is gone, all the props in the world start looking like props. That is the part nobody who built a persona around luxury ever wants to face. But it may be exactly where Ross is standing right now. So now I want your honest take. Did Rick Ross actually damage his own legacy with the way he handled all of this? Or is the internet doing what it always does, turning a few ugly optics into a full-blown collapse story because it's more entertaining that way? Do you think the airport clip means anything? Do you think the jewelry conversation did real damage? Do you think Ross kept the Drake feud alive way too long? Do you think 50 Cent has been winning the long game against him for years? Do you think Officer Ricky is still the deepest cut in his public image? And when Ross said that $150 million was set in stone, do you think that was confidence, or a mistake? Most importantly, do you think set in stone saves this stretch, or do you think this rollout already exposed too much for the music to fully change the conversation? Drop your opinion below. And don't play safe either. I want the real answer. Did the boss get unfairly clowned? Or did the mask finally slip? If this breakdown gave you a new perspective, hit the like button, subscribe, and send this to somebody who still thinks Rick Ross can cruise through this without consequences. Because whether you love him, doubt him, or think this whole thing is overblown, one thing is obvious now. Rick Ross is no longer moving through this chapter untouched. And once the public sees you touched, the story changes. I'll catch you in the next one.